Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and as always we like to be topical. So today we're going to look at an important date, and that is the 14th of April in 1912. And the reason why that date's so important is it's actually the date that RMS Titanic struck an iceberg out in the Atlantic. So we thought today we'll have a little discussion, a little chat about RMS Titanic, and we've also got a local link. Worcester is really linked to everything. So this is one of our replica items that we bring when we do a talk on the RMS Titanic, and it's actually the register for RMS Titanic. And as I always say when we do a talk on this subject, this is quite a sad document because it's the birth and death certificate of a ship. So this was filled in when the ship is first put into the water, so this is going back to at least 1910. And sadly the red writing across the middle is basically saying that she sank mid-Atlantic in 1912 on the 15th of April 1912. So today is actually the anniversary of the striking of the iceberg in the Atlantic, and then obviously in the hours that followed she slowly sank before the water. Now, RMS Titanic was part of the White Star Line, and I think whoever was doing the marketing at the time did a very, very good job. This is another replica, and this is of the leaflets that came out when she was first built. And as it says, 45,000 tonnes, which always amazes me how 45,000 tonnes stays afloat. The other interesting thing about the RMS Titanic is she was the biggest thing afloat at the time. If you compare her with modern cruise liners, for example, she is nothing more than a lifeboat when you compare the two. But as you can see, straight away you know who produced the Titanic, because it's the White Star Line, so it's very good marketing. And I also like the fact that the leaflet opens out bit by bit, which just goes to show how big she is. So it starts there and then it opens out, and it's an amazing cutaway showing the full length of the ship. And as I always say, from the pointy end to the blunt end. Obviously I'm not a sailor, I don't know much about ships, but it's a perfect leaflet just to tell people that this thing is absolutely huge. And people paid for tickets to go aboard her, and the local papers and even the national and international papers made a big thing of its size. And I do like this because it compares the Titanic with the pyramids at Giza, St. Paul's Cathedral, and other large, well-known and iconic monuments at the time. But she was often referred to as an unsinkable ship, and there's got to be a reason for it, because even at the time people said she was unsinkable. And there were several reasons behind her ability to stay afloat, and the main one was the fact that she had many bulkheads. So in the dark, in the lines in the dark pen, the thicker pen, you will see these are individual bulkheads. And what that meant is if she struck an iceberg or struck anything at sea or just sprang a leak, what would happen is they would close these bulkheads off, and therefore the water will only fill up one bulkhead. However, famously, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, she went down nose first, and that was because each of these compartments started to fill. But you're probably thinking, why did they fill up and overspill? Because these bulkheads are meant to hold the water in one place. The problem is the bulkheads ended quite low down. You will see that in the drawing. They don't go all the way up. There were several reasons behind that, but the main reason was the fact that the bulkheads, if they'd gone all the way up to the top of the ship, would have made it heavier, but mainly it would have made the first class compartments a lot smaller than they actually were. And the idea is this ship had to be an amazing ship, a floating top quality hotel. Now, most people always comment about the lifeboats, the lack of lifeboats on board the Titanic. But the interesting thing is 1912, or even when we go back to 1910 when she was built, there was plenty of lifeboats on board. 20 lifeboats is all she legally had to carry. But the interesting thing is Titanic had just a few more than 20 lifeboats. So the interesting thing is she was legal, she was over the legal requirement for lifeboats on board. So I have here a little model. This is a model that I made some time ago now. It's a little Airfix model, in fact. And I also use this to give people an introduction to the Titanic. And she is an amazing ship, 45,000 tons, the largest thing afloat. You can see here on the boat deck the individual lifeboats scattered around. They were wooden lifeboats, but there were also some collapsible lifeboats which do get a mention in the report after the sinking of the Titanic. So like I said, she had plenty of lifeboats on board. At the pointy end, yes, it has got a technical name. At the pointy end here, we'll move our way back. We have the forward mast, which had the state-of-the-art Marconi radio system aboard. And this little white object there, with a little brass coloured object above, is actually the crow's nest, where two people saw the iceberg at the last minute and gave the warning. Obviously that became too late. As we go further back, most of the lower classes lived in the lower parts of the ship. That was steerage, which was third class passengers, and then right at the very top with beautiful views, including access to the many restaurants and also a gym on board and swimming pool, remember. This was for the first class, the upper classes. There was a big class system in the Edwardian era, as there had been going right back in history. Interesting fact about the funnels, we have 4 funnels. In fact, only 3 of them were real. One of the funnels were added on as a fake funnel just to make the Titanic look bigger than she actually was. And then as we go down to the other end of the ship, we finally have the power supply, the 3 big engines or 3 big propellers at the back that would propel it across the Atlantic. Now, the Titanic was an absolutely fantastic thing, and people are often saying how bad it was, how the third class passengers was treated. But what you have to remember is, put it into context, that was the normal way people were treated at the time. There was a big hierarchy, a big class system. And this is obvious when you start looking at things such as the third class or even the middle class passengers. Cutlery, for example, this is crockery off the table, it's only a side plate, but you'll see the White Star Line badge in the middle. It's pretty basic, whereas when we compare it to the first class passengers had a much more decorated piece of crockery. If we compare it to the menus, we have here a third class menu, which actually covers things such as gruel, cabin biscuits, but also mentions roast beef in brown gravy. So they were actually, in many cases, getting better food than they did when they were back in Southampton or wherever they were from when they got aboard. I do have a first class passengers menu, and that's typical. It's got some fine things on here. Salmon mayonnaise, potted shrimps, we've got grilled mutton chops, we've got chicken a la Maryland, fillets of brill, and then we've got some fine desserts including Cheshire cheese, Stilton cheese, Gorgonzola, Edam. It's absolutely fantastic. It's mouth-watering, in fact. And when you look at what passengers had with them, the first class passengers were generally given a little guide to who they were aboard the ship with, and this had all the great and the good in. However, the third class passengers had to carry an inspection card proving that they had no infectious diseases, and they would have been regularly checked during their passage across the Atlantic. But we know that the Titanic set sail on the 10th of April, around about midday, and then sadly at 11:40 this evening in 1912, she strikes an iceberg. There was a whole catalogue of problems with the Titanic, including very cheap manufactured rivets, including the fact that the bulkheads didn't go all the way to the top. But then there was even more problems when she actually struck. To start with, Bruce Ismay, who was on board the ship, who worked for the White Star Line, he was the man that kept on pushing to get Captain Smith to go faster. He wanted the record to be broken. He wanted the Titanic to get across the Atlantic in the fastest time. So was she going too fast? Then there was also the ice reports that kept coming in, and believe it or not, Captain Smith did eventually listen to these ice reports, and it is said altered his course slightly. Well, if that was the case, he may have actually put the Titanic directly on the alignment to hit that iceberg. Then we've also got the story of Reginald Lee and Frederick Fleet in the Crow's Nest. They didn't have binoculars, probably because the locker with the binoculars in had been locked, so they were using just their own eyesight. The interesting thing about those is because it was a calm evening, they wouldn't have even seen waves breaking on the iceberg, so there was major problems that led to it. And then the final nail in the coffin, I often think, was Officer Murdoch, First Officer Murdoch. He was the quartermaster on board the Titanic, and he did two things, which is textbook. He slowed the ship down when he saw something in front of it, and then he turned away from it. Sadly, that caused a problem. Slowing the ship down makes the manoeuvring slower, obviously, and by moving away from the iceberg, it meant the iceberg bounced along the outside. A 300-foot gash was broken into the side of the Titanic this evening at 11:40 in 1912, and sadly the ship went down. Now, I said we've got a local link. We have, and one of the things I want to end on is these here are the three victims from Worcestershire. We have, first of all, Mr. Frank Millett on the right hand side there. We have Henry Morley in the centre, and then on the far left, Mr. Henry Spinner. They're the three that are mentioned in the Worcester News, believe it or not. And this is a fantastic picture. Worcester Cathedral next to the Titanic iceberg. Just to say, this iceberg was absolutely huge. So this evening, spare a thought for about 1,500 people that perished on board the Titanic. If you're interested, we do talks all the time to different groups and organisations, so do get in contact. When the lockdown finishes, we can do a talk on the Titanic or many other topics included. Anyway, stay safe as normal. Remember those poor souls that lost their lives in 1912, and see you soon. Bye bye.